Hey everyone, the purpose of this video is to give us a bit of background in terms of how segregation became legalized in the United States of America. What we're going to be looking at the very start of the civil rights movement unit, rights and freedoms, is what life was like in the US for African Americans and for other colored people. Um, it's important for us to get a sense of the context, and that is looking at things that led up to segregation becoming legalized and the civil rights movement that set about trying to fight against that. So it's important to note that we can only really give you a brief overview of the chain of causation leading up to the civil rights movement. There were some very specific events that happened in even the century prior to the civil rights movement that contributed to segregation becoming legalized and the civil rights movement responding to that. Because we only have a brief period of time to cover this, I would recommend that you access this PowerPoint and access some of these YouTube links that will lead you to videos that will cover more things in detail if you are interested. This PowerPoint is up on the portal, and it will also be in my OneNote as well. So in the 1950s, America became a very prosperous nation after World War II. More families, more citizens of the US were entering what we would consider the middle class. And what that looked like was that people were able to afford cars. They were able to afford home appliances. Many of them had televisions in their homes. And a whole lot of building projects sprung up in the US because the population was booming. People were becoming more affluent and more rich, and the economy was growing. But on the other side of it, we also saw, what also happened was that there was mass discrimination and segregation in particular parts of the US. We see a clear separation between people who are colored and people who are white. We can see that this was encouraged by people who had certain attitudes towards race and towards ethnicity. And we can also see that while African Americans and other colored people had facilities that were the same as white people, as you can see with this photograph of the drink tap, you can see that they weren't at the same standard. So while there might have been equality, quote unquote, in terms of access to similar facilities, similar institutions like education, there wasn't much equity. Equity kind of meaning fairness, because the quality of what they were able to access was not the same. And it was very evident that whatever state or society or community they were in had certain views about which people group was superior and which was inferior. So in the 1950s, we can kind of see that these four elements were present: segregation, Jim Crow laws, which is the term used for the discriminatory and racist laws that enforce segregation; lynching, which was a form of violence directed towards African Americans and other colored people, which was an extremely dehumanizing way of killing someone. It involved publicly hanging African Americans as a way of instilling fear, and could also involve burning, castration, and dismemberment. So pretty severe in terms of violence. Lynching was not legal, but in certain states and certain communities, there wasn't much done to police it. And we also had a form of terrorism in the form of intimidation, in the form of the Ku Klux Klan, which is and was a white supremacist group that actually sprung up much earlier, before the actual civil rights movement, but was still prominent. So these are the four things that we can use to establish a chain of causation leading up to the legalization of segregation, which happened because of this court case here, Plessy versus Ferguson. So in Year 9, you would have covered some aspect of slavery and how slaves were transported from Africa to Western countries. So this happened in the US in the 1619. I think importantly, to link to our idea of one people group being superior to another, slaves were not considered human beings, they were considered property. property by whoever bought them, whoever owned them, and therefore they had no citizenship rights because property cannot have rights. The motivation to treat them as inferior was supported by these Darwinian ideas about race. And what that means is that people back in the time believed that human beings existed in a hierarchy, kind of similar to how the Nazis considered Jews at the bottom or not even in the hierarchy. So slavery was prominent in this area of the United States called the South because of the economic importance of cotton farming. The states that formed part of the South, their economies largely relied on cotton farming, on agriculture, and they needed a prominent labor force in order to actually make money and keep this economy growing. So it wasn't just a matter of dehumanization. Slavery also had a practical and economic purpose. For some richer families in the South, owning slaves was a way of life, and it was also a symbol of status and wealth. So there, slavery was part of the fabric of society in that the amount of slaves that you had kind of showed everyone around you how important or how rich or how powerful you were as well. So this is a map of the states of the United States at the time of the Civil War. The states in green are the ones that are designated the South. Now, this doesn't, just because they are called the South, you can see that there are other states that you could see are at the southern part of America. But these states specifically were called the South because the South wasn't so much a geographical label as much it was a cultural label. The Southern way of life, Southern hospitality. The South was a place with a particular group of people who had a particular kind of mindset, as a generalization. One generalization we can make of Southern attitudes towards slavery is embodied by this guy, John C. Calhoun, who was actually a senator in the US Congress. And you can see from this quote that he really strongly believed that slavery actually improved the quality of life of the slaves themselves. He's kind of here saying that the quality of life that they had before they became slaves was not as good as what they had now. You can see that he believed that they were physically improved, morally improved, and intellectually improved. And you can also see from the bottom paragraph that he firmly believed in that sense of hierarchy, of one race or one ethnic group being superior to the other. After a while, the Civil War happened from 1861 to 1865. And the Civil War itself is a really interesting period in American history, looking at why it happened, what happened during it, and how it shaped the nation afterwards. In relation to what we're talking about, the Civil War was fought between the Union, which consisted of states in the North. Again, the North is more than just a geographical designation, but more of a cultural one, and the Confederacy. You may have heard things about the Confederate flag. The Confederate flag was a flag that was created by the leaders of the South because they wanted to actually secede or split off from the United States and form their own government. The actual Civil War was fought partly over the issue of the right to own slaves. In the middle of this war, in 1863, the president at the time, Abraham Lincoln, he issued what is called the Emancipation Proclamation, which was not law, but it was a signal from the federal government that they believed that anyone who was a slave should be considered free. And there's a huge backstory leading up to that. In fact, if you want to know more about it, you can watch the film Lincoln, starring Daniel Day-Lewis. After the Civil War was won by the Union, or the North, they had to do something to rebuild the nation because the Civil War essentially divided the United States. So the government had to try and find a way to bring together white Southerners who wanted to secede or split off from the United States, but also newly freed blacks. And they had to make sure that the freedom that the blacks now had because of this victory in the Civil War would be secure. Now, during the Reconstruction period, life did improve for former slaves. They did have access to public school education. They did access the right to become a politician, and African American men did receive the right to vote. Also, something that happened during the Reconstruction was that three amendments were made to the Constitution. The Constitution is a document that outlines the fundamental principles and beliefs which informed how a nation is governed. So, kind of like the supreme law of the land. We have a constitution in Australia. So, there were three amendments. The first one, the 13th, outlawed slavery for good. The 14th gave African Americans the right to citizenship. And the 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote. And these were really important because it meant that in the fabric of American society, the Constitution was saying that now these are the rights that people have. Unfortunately, during the 1870s, Reconstruction failed for complex reasons. It's really hard to kind of summarize it, but I guess we can kind of see it as three things. So politicians who are pushing for racial equality lost power and influence. I think an important part of that is that Abraham Lincoln was actually assassinated, and the person who took over after him, Andrew Johnson, was way more interested in uniting the nation than actually protecting the rights of newly freed slaves. You can see that in point 2 as well. And number 3, the amendments were not really enforced by the federal government. Because it's one thing to enact new laws, to change the constitution, but it's another thing to enforce that, and it's another thing also to change people's attitudes. Just because the law changes doesn't mean people's attitudes change. What this meant was that Southern governments who were opposed to racial equality in the states, predominantly in the South, could impose laws that restricted the rights of African Americans, and they did in different ways. Around this time as well, the Ku Klux Klan arose, who their primary goal was to intimidate and to terrorize African Americans, colored people, and also people who supported giving rights to African Americans and colored people, intimidating them to back down. And they were highly organized, very powerful, very influential, even at a governmental level. And you can see that the bottom photo is a really famous photo of a lynching. And eventually, in 1896, a case brought to the Supreme Court of the United States, which is the highest court in the land, established that separating the races was not actually against the Constitution as long as conditions were equal. Right? The reason why these laws were called Jim Crow laws is because of this character here, Jim Crow, who was actually a minstrel and who was played by white actors in blackface. If you don't know what blackface is, it's basically a white person or a person of a different background painting themselves black and then portraying a black person, often in a derogatory and over-exaggerated manner, which is why the laws became known as Jim Crow laws, because it was discriminatory. What the court case did was it gave state governments a legal right to segregate the societies. And this would not really change until 1955, so a good 60 years later. So to summarize, you can see here on this slide, you might want to pause it. This is a summary of the 4 different events, how they're linked together, and how it ended up with legal segregation. So I hope that was informative for you, just kind of a brief overview. Again, if you want to look into any of these things in a bit more detail, there will be resources up on the portal, up on the OneNote, or wherever your teacher has posted them. I strongly encourage you, if you are interested in looking into any of these things in more detail, to do so, because it will actually help you to understand more of the civil rights movement and more of what people were actually fighting for.